All right, all right, all right. How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome to episode 14, I believe, of Left Reckoning. My name is David Griscom, and I'm joined by my friend and comrade Matt Leck. How's it going, brother?
It's going very well, David. 14, a number important to numerology if you grew up being a football fan, in which case base 7 is very important to you. Or not base 7, I guess, but seven-digit increments become, they have significance.
Matt bringing the Americana today. Well, we got a lot, and we're going to be covering not just movements across the United States South, but also things that are going up in the Northeast, taking a deep dive as well into movements in Latin America as the left tries to claw its way back from the right-wing resurgence. So much to talk about. Particularly, we're going to be speaking in a little bit with Nathan Bernard about how to beat liberal union busters. Yes, that is a thing that exists, and they get paid a lot of money to try to harm working people across the country, and in this case, in particular, nurses who are trying to defend their community from the novel coronavirus. And then a little bit after that, we're going to be talking about what Kamala Harris is calling the future water wars and how oil is abandoning the state of Texas. Thanks everybody so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate all of you, and especially our patrons who help us build this show and this program. It's been a really beautiful journey, and there's a lot more ahead of us. But I think we have to start with the major story of the day, which is the early results that we're getting from the union fight in Bessemer, Alabama. For folks who are unfamiliar, though I'm sure most people at this point know what's going on, the workers in Bessemer, Alabama have been organizing to form a union. That union move has been met with some of the most egregious, and if I'm going to be completely frank with folks, likely illegal tactics from Amazon, along with incredible amounts of money poured into the area to prevent people from making sure that they get fair wages, that they are not forced to do things like piss in bottles, to make sure that people have the dignity that they deserve, because those are the people who are making the profits that line the pockets of the wealthiest man in the world. Now, what we've been seeing early on has not been particularly inspiring for a successful vote. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about why we should not lose hope, and some of the tactics that Amazon has used. But let me say this right now. If we had the PRO Act passed, and remember, the PRO Act is essentially just a law that is returning a lot of the rights that the union movement had won already back into place. If we had the PRO Act, then the workers at Amazon would already be represented by a union. The reason that all of these corporations, and the reason that we're seeing such hesitance even from the Biden administration for passing the PRO Act, is that it would be a landmark shift in the ability of workers to form unions in this country. As it exists now, forming a union in the private sector is extremely hard. And it allows corporations like Amazon to bring in all of these hired guns who are, frankly, experts at making sure that people are as confused as possible about what a union represents. And again, we're going to be, and it's not just Amazon. Like, we're going to be talking a little bit with Nathan Bernard, who broke down what's going on in Maine, where nurses are trying to form a union as well. Right? This is a huge industry, but it can't be overstated just how powerful Amazon is, and a lot of the tactics that they've been using to prevent this, a yes vote to come into play. These tactics have been quite egregious. But I guess, should we start with the vote, just so everybody knows what we're talking about? Remember, for folks who are going to be listening later, actually, let me just say this real quick. It's April 8th. It's 7:08 p.m. Central Time. We don't know what the end results are going to be. Amazon has challenged the ballots of a few hundred votes. And remember, this is a pool of around like 3,000 voters. So it's a significant amount of votes that are sort of being held up right now. Amazon wouldn't be challenging votes that are no's. So it's very likely that those votes that are being held up are yes votes. That being said, um, what we're seeing from the early results is almost a 2-to-1 no to yes ratio. Do we have that New York Times update handy?
Yeah, I have it up there right now.
Okay. Yeah, so what we're seeing right now, as of April 8th, I don't have it up in front of me, so I can't read it to y'all, but it's
Yeah,
about
I'll read it
twofold.
here. With about half the ballots counted late Thursday, votes against unionization had more than 2-to-1 advantage over those in favor, according to a live broadcast of the counting that was tallied by the New York Times.
Mm.
And I should note that there was other tallies going on. The Alabama local paper was doing it too. When the counting paused, there were more than 1,100 votes against unionization and 463 in support. The incomplete tally put Amazon on the cusp of defeating. Yeah.
So let's start with a couple quick things, right? So when this initiative first happened, Amazon increased the pool of people who would need to be covered by the union. They did that for a very tactical reason, was to disperse essentially the groups of folks who were going to be voting in the election, right? So that they could target certain groups to prevent them from being able to coalesce together, right? Because you had people who aren't interacting with each other on a regular basis. But they were able to get something close to about 3,000 cards in favor of unionization originally. And again, if the PRO Act were law today, that would mean that they would have a union and they would have union representation, which just underlines how important that legislation could be for the union movement, and why, if you have the opportunity to, it's something that's very important to lobby for. But I wanted to say, as we're seeing these results come in, we don't know what the end result will be. From some of I saw that Kim Kelly, who is a great reporter on this, was saying that some of her sources were saying that some of the information that they've gotten seems to indicate that many of the voters put those ballots in February, which means that all of the media blitz, the Bernie Sanders appearance, all those things,
Joe Biden
um,
come lately.
Joe Biden come lately, basically happened after a significant amount of people had already voted. All right. Again, we don't know what the end result's going to be, but we just want people to understand what's going on there. But let's talk about what the long-term deal is for this unionization move. There is almost 100% going to be a challenge, because Amazon put their finger on the scale in extremely egregious ways, from encouraging people who were contract workers, who weren't going to be people who were going to be voting in this, to wear anti-union signs, to be able to pull people into meetings where they explained what the union is, right? Where they had Amazon paid shills come in and basically lie about what a union is and what it represents. And make sure that people were not able to get the information. For example, that warehouse workers in the surrounding area who are represented by unions make significantly more money than the people at these Amazon facilities do, right?
Yeah. And those sorts of captive audience meetings are bad and shouldn't be allowed at any point. But it's also, especially as we'll talk about with Nathan, during coronavirus, when these people are already like completely like worked to the bone, that you're going to make them basically scare them about their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
is horrible.
And that's exactly what it is. Plus, the really difficult task that we have on the left today and in the labor movement across the board is to convince people that there's something, that we can do something, right? Because a lot of people are fearful, and this is why this kind of work is so difficult. I'm not a union organizer. I don't go in and have these conversations with folks, but I know enough people around me to understand what that kind of experience of precarity is like, and why a lot of people don't think that, politics or organizing is something that can change their lives. Many people just say, I'm going to go in, put my head down, and just be happy that I have a paycheck at the end of the day. And that is a scenario that Amazon takes advantage of, not just on the shop floor, but also politically, that the gutting of public services, the gutting of workers' rights, allow them to take advantage of people, because people know if you lose your job in this society, you are going to be thrown to the wolves, right?
Yeah.
And they take advantage, and they have an active interest in maintaining that system.
They love
That
it.
being that being said, the state, at least on a theoretical level, is something that should be open game for us to be able to win and to utilize to our advantage. The problem right now is that the state, both local government in Alabama and also national government in the United States, is not particularly inclined to help out workers, especially if it means structural reforms. And do you have this from the More Perfect Union, Matt, about this USPS mailbox? Because this is a story that is not isolated, because this is not the only tactic that Amazon used. We talked about how they were paying people to wear, buttons. Talk about how they were basically making people sit into mandatory instruction sessions where they just pump them up with anti-union propaganda, among other things. This story is pretty exceptional, because what the More Perfect Union has found was that there was this very mysterious mailbox that was put into place on the Amazon property. And it should be said that the NLRB early on said that they weren't going to have an in-person election, which is typical for this kind of move, but they were rather going to do a mail election. Almost immediately when that happened, Amazon started lobbying that the USPS would put a mailbox on Amazon's property. The NLRB said this is illegal, and they said Amazon is not allowed to go through with this, and they also said that the USPS is not allowed to do it. But Amazon continued to pressure the USPS, who initially was saying no, but eventually relented and put on this very mysterious mailbox onto the Amazon property. Right? Matt and I were talking, this is something that is illegal. And this is why I'm saying that there should be, and will be, I hope, a challenge to this election result if we do not see a yes vote win out, right? Because this is an attempt at intimidation. And more importantly, this is an attempt at surveillance, because Amazon wanted to make sure that they saw who was showing up and voting, right? Because if you don't vote, that's an automatic no vote, right? They wanted to make sure that they were seeing who was going in, so that they could, one, lobby them, intimidate them, etc. Right? This is something.
Just have that info. It's just nice to know if you're a boss.
Yeah. This is something that is absolutely ridiculous. It's terrible also that the Postal Service, relented to Amazon. But it's not isolated. As we were talking about with the good fellows at the Valley Labor Report, Amazon also was able to lobby the local government to shorten the length of the red light near the facility, because pro-union organizers were showing up in the morning and telling people, hey, this is why being a union is a good thing. Amazon was able to lobby, I can't remember if it was the county or the state, I believe it was the county, to change the timing on that red light so that it became shorter, so that that folks would be spoken to when they're in their cars, right? That's just what's happening in the public sphere, right? Where Amazon is a very powerful force, but they're not the ending authority. Imagine what was going on in the workplace for folks.
Yeah. Do you have anything more to say? Because this kind of reminds me of what we were talking about with Paul O'Connell on James Connolly. The whole, the aspiration of basically a worker movement that won't have workers divided, and say you'll have USPS doing Amazon a solid and putting a ballot box, installing a ballot box for them. So people should check that out. That was for patrons on Sunday.
The
But
James Connolly conversation, yeah.
yeah, that, I guess that's just fresh in my mind. That it seems like, we're at a point now where we can hear about this and think people will leak stuff to like Ken Klippenstein. But we don't have the point where instead of, having to leak it, people can just say to their coworkers, hey, this should actually stop. And that's the point we have to get to.
Yes, exactly. And thank you, Matt, because that's the shift that people need to understand. I'm painting this picture because the fight against Amazon was a huge fight. Again, we don't know how this is going to turn out. I still have hope and belief that we will get a positive result. And also, I have a feeling this is going to go on a lot longer, right? But the point is this: the reason that this movement in Bessemer, Alabama was so exciting was not because we thought that it was a slam dunk, a sure thing, 100% going to happen, but the fact that it is happening. that there are people who are showing up and saying that they want to see something different. And this is spreading from Alabama all the way across the country. People are getting more militant and preparing to take on not just Amazon, but employers across the board. We have this from Chicago. Do we have the video here or the statement?
The statement. Do you want me to read the statement?
Yeah, why don't you do that? Where folks were able to stage a walkout in response to inhumane working conditions that folks have been facing in Chicago.
Yeah, so this is Amazonians United Chicagoland on Facebook. It's been 6 months of this inhumane 1:20 to 11:50 a.m. mega cycle shift, constant speed up and disrespect from management. We have so many stories of our lives being disrupted by Amazon's national change to the mega cycle. So many mothers now struggling to care for their families. So many of us waking up feeling like zombies every day after just a short little nap, pushing ourselves to keep working this shift out of necessity. Today we got fed up and walked out demanding the mega cycle shift, schedule accommodations for people who need it, lift rides to and from work, 2% night shift differential instead of the week 50 cent they give us, and respect for the full 20 minutes paid break. Seems to be a theme with Amazon in those breaks. And then I'll pull up the video as well. 1 second, let me make it a little smaller. Here's them. Here's video of this walkout.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the point is here is that this is not going away. From what we saw early in the pandemic with Chris Smalls and many other brave organizers at that facility in Amazon, to what we've seen in in Alabama, to what we're seeing in Chicago, this is continuing, and it's not just going to be limited to warehouse workers. We got a really encouraging result from the NLRB earlier today, which ruled that Amazon illegally fired activist workers who are working in their headquarters in Seattle, who were basically demanding and trying to organize people around the insane carbon emissions that Amazon is responsible for, right? They were found to be fired illegally by Amazon, right? So there is movement that is going on across the board. This is not a fight. This is not a fight that is simple. This is not a fight that is easy, but the only thing that we have and the advantage that we have is our ability to light 1,000 small fires and to take them down. And we can do this, and it is happening. And we have to continue to support one another, to continue to participate in organizations, and to understand this is a long fight. Because if you wear your heart and soul on every single fight and think that if you don't get positive results in every single one, and then become completely demoralized and hopeless, we will lose. But if you understand that these are encouraging signs that people are saying no, and that it's going to take a while for us to build the strategy and the movements that are successful, but the movement is happening, the polarization is happening, that's how we're going to win. I hate sometimes, sometimes I wish we were on radio so that we could play a song or something like that. But
Yeah.
I
know that would be awesome. Get something a little bit
I'm thinking about the song Joe Hill. I don't know if you're familiar with that song, Matt.
Remind me.
It's one of the great, it's one of the no, it's not that one. It's one of the great labor songs, and it's about a union activist who was framed for murder and shot by a firing squad by the copper bosses because he was trying to organize a union in 1917 in the United States, long before we saw the rise and success of unions that we long for today. This was the pre-times. This is when this fight was not just very serious, but a life and death fight, and it still is a life and death fight today. But it was
like explicit murder death squad fight.
With what they can do is they're not as overt in their ability to just be able to murder people in the street like they used to be.
You remember that Silicon Valley clip that Michael always liked to play, which is the guy looking out over the protesters and saying, 100 years ago, we would have been able to have people like that killed. uh,
Yeah.
and like I'm not doing it justice. Very funny clip, but I mean, yeah. Let's see. I wouldn't put it past them to like let's bring a little bit of that back, folks.
I'm sure they're ready for it, man.
Yeah. I think we already sort of teased the Patreon already. So patreon.com/left reckoning to get that James Connolly conversation with Paul O'Connell. Um, and anything else you want to say before we go to Nathan Bernard?
No, definitely. Just stick around afterwards because we're gonna be talking about what's going on in Ecuador as the left is clawing its way back and understand, which is a great lesson for us. Is saying that this fight goes on for a very long time. We're gonna be talking about what's going on in Texas as oil is abandoning the state and much more. So join us back on the other side for that too.
Let's see you, folks. All right. Welcome back to Left Reckoning. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. And joining us is Nathan Bernard, or at Nathan T. Bernard on Twitter, where you'll find him to be a pugnacious free speech activist of the sort with it's sort of ironic, not repellent politics. And also he writes about Maine for the Mainer News Co-op, which we'll talk about a bit later. But Nathan is here to talk to us about the story in the Mainer. I'll put it up now. Liberal union buster on the loose in Portland. Maine Med's shameful campaign to kill its nurses drive for a more democratic workplace. And I'll just give some numbers from your article here before you talk about these nurses who are the most important people in the story. But 1,900 Maine Med nurses, and there's a few other hospitals involved there, would be joining the already 2,000 member strong Maine State Nurses Association. So tell us like what you're hearing from these nurses. They started formally making this effort to unionize in January.
Yeah, I mean, it started back in 2019, and this is the third time now that they've tried to unionize. Happened in 1976 was the first drive, and then 2000 before. And I talked to some organizers and nurses that were involved in those pushes, and just unfortunately, here in this case, I mean, the demands, I guess, are around like staffing shortages, exacerbated by COVID, obviously. But again, started in 2019, so there's already issues. It got worsened, with like they're being overworked, underpaid, of course. And ultimately, their pitch for this of why they want a union is that, like in their case, if you get a union, you have better working conditions, you have more staff, you can provide better patient care. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's something like there's been a lot of support from the community as well, of course. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, like those demands haven't changed since 1976. Those have been the problems at Maine Med, which is by far the biggest hospital in Maine. Like not just nurses in total, it, employs about 20,000 people. So a massive employer in Maine also means it has a lot of power, has a lot of money. Instead of listening to nurses, their kind of go-to has been pick up the phone and call the union busting firms to come run union avoidance campaigns. So yeah, that's kind of the lay of the land of what's been going on.
Yeah, and that brings us to the sort of first image in this article here, these wanted posters for these union busters. And, we talk about vaccines and distribution, and you don't want to create too much of a scarcity mindset because we want everyone to get vaccinated. However, when Maine Medical is coming in and vaccinating labor relations consultants and people that are doing billing, it caused quite a stir. Let us tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean the wanted posters are actually how I found out about Joseph Brock, who is leading this union busting campaign, because a lot of the time, even in the case of Amazon, you may know the name of the firm, but the people themselves remain kind of faceless throughout this. So it was interesting, for one, just to see union busters' faces actually plastered around Portland's. The cover photo that we have on the website, that's on a famous punk rock club here called Gino's, which is like on the main strip. So it's basically their entire wall, which is covered with these wanted posters. So like the wanted posters came about because of this. So in February, there was a leak to the press that showed that Maine Med had vaccinated its entire staff, which was against, the people, like the state guidelines, first off. But they're also providing vaccines to people that are in the back office and doing billing and on their marketing teams. Yeah. Joseph Brock also, as people looked further into that leak, it ends up that the union busters that came out of state to bust the union, they're coming from New York and Florida, right? Like they had gotten the vaccines ahead of even the back office workers and everything. So the first thing that Maine Med did was they defended vaccinating the back office workers, essentially saying, I think the terminology they used was protecting infrastructure or something. Like their idea was that, well, if there's a huge wave of COVID that hits here, we're going to need to set up emergency vax tents, and who knows, the billing people might be giving out vaccinations, right? Like, who knows? Not actually.
Or maybe the vaccine people will be helped getting on some billing, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all already so backwards. And then it comes out that they find out that, oh, well, yes, protecting infrastructure, whatever. And again, scarcity mindset. We want as many people as possible to get the vaccine, right? Like, understood. But, ultimately, like when you do something like provide a vaccine to the union buster guys coming out of town, and then they apologize for that, I mean, that made national news. Like, did you guys see that when that hit national news and everything? Yeah, so it had like headlines on Vice and everything saying, Maine Med Hospital apologizes for, providing vaccines to out-of-state union busters or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, ultimately, I mean, it's like protecting infrastructure, and there's a lot of op-eds from nurses and patients and people that used to previously work in Maine Med that they weren't fooled by that stuff. No one was. The people in the hospital weren't. The patients. Is pretty clear that they're prioritizing profit over people's health, right? And like choosing, to protect revenues rather than protect patients, because by like even with the back office people, the folks that you're providing those vaccines to, it could be going to an at-risk person in Maine, and Maine has the highest median age of the entire country, right? And our guidelines for the vaccine, because of that, have been a little bit weird. It's been purely based off age. So because we have that really old population, some are cynical and like, oh, it's because that's a voting block that is important to people like Janet Mills, who's up for re-election in 2022. But, it's just, that's like our biggest chunk of the population. But yeah, I mean, it didn't get past anyone. And yeah, the wanted signs were hilarious. And it's just a cool thing to kind of see.
Yeah, let's talk about Mills, and then I want to talk about the Troy Jackson. But first, Mills, she's got a conflict of interest. How has she been? What's her role been in this?
I mean, pretty hands off, right? Like her sister, like maybe you see in the article, works at Maine Health. So, and that's the parent company of Maine Med. I mean, she gave that, like, it was good when she came out, and she definitely took the side of the workers and everything when this happened and said it's reprehensible. I condemn this. It's absurd that, people, and which could have been up to 10,000 potential vaccines were given out before this was even caught wind of. So that 10,000 people would be prioritized at the most at risk. She says that, but, she just condemned it and kind of moved on, right? It wasn't, she didn't do much past that. I mean, Troy Jackson is the guy that is our Senate president here, is a union guy in the past. He used to be in like the loggers union, was a logger up in like way far north Maine before he was in the state Senate. So he's been very vocal, which has been great. But yeah, Mills, meh.
And I would just add that, this fight is obviously really important because you're talking about fighting for nurses, but it shows those certain parts of the community that have a lot of like organic support for them. Like much like when we saw like the teacher strikes in red states a couple of years ago, like everybody understands how important nurses are. And I don't know, because it's an interesting time politically, obviously, because we have needed people in the medical, field to really donate a lot of their time and sacrifice to protect the community, which I'm sure is like a big basis of the anti-union arguments that we're seeing from the opponents, saying, "Oh, they can't have all these things because then we won't be able to do what we need to do to stop COVID." But just like when you're talking about something like, Amazon, which is an organization that can like deliver products very quickly, like the way you solve those kind of issues of capacity is by increasing like the pool of workers, right? And you increase the pool of workers by increasing and bettering their working conditions, right? So it's something that everybody can come together on.
Yeah, I think the teachers are a really interesting analogy too. I interviewed a guy that is a national policy director for AFL-CIO for this piece, and then I also interviewed the head of the AFL-CIO here, Matt Schlobum, and the guy Christian Sweeney, the national policy director. He brought up exactly what you just did with like in the red states and teachers organizing, and I think it's something that there can be a lot of groundswell of support in the communities too. Like we saw a patient letter here that was signed by thousands of people, because you can really rationalize it of that if you have better working conditions, you have better staff, especially during COVID, that your service that these workers are providing is going to be better. You're going to get a better education. If you're a teacher, if they have more staff and more resources to provide better education, like you're going to get, better medical care here, because you're giving better working conditions and more staff to the nurses, so they're not working themselves into the ground. So that's that's definitely part of the reason why it's been there's been such a groundswell of support. And everyone, like Troy Jackson, like his letter was very personal, and everyone has a personal experience that they can talk about of I was in the hospital, my family member was in the hospital, they were hurt, right? Or they needed a surgery, and the doctors performed the surgery, but the nurses are your family, right? And they're the ones that are going to be around you, especially during COVID when you can't have your loved ones with you. They fill that role for you. So I don't know, there's definitely just, I think in general, as you talk about Amazon and just essential workers too, I think I'm not a labor expert, right? But like, there's definitely, at least from this, like been a shift of just the thought that like an essential worker is expendable, is how people used to talk about it before. Oh, you're, a minimum wage worker, you churn them out. And in a lot of these jobs, there are high churn, right? But here, like you're an essential worker, they're worth, especially during the pandemic, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for folks like nurses and the frontline workers and the people that are still going to work every day to do this. You're essential for a reason. So yeah, I think just, it is like people are realizing their power in these situations, and like Amazon, we'll see how that goes. And even if it's not successful, like it's like the thinking has changed, I think. So yeah. I mean, it's a very clear, the teachers and nurses, especially, that's like very clear, like analogy between the two, I think.
Yeah, the COVID part of this is interesting too, because that letter Troy signed and the lawmaker signed was specifically mentioning these captive audience meetings and type of anti-union harassment going on during COVID. And I want to play this ad here just before we get into Brock himself a little bit deeper. But here's an ad from Maine Health. COVID made us vulnerable. Don't let the union take advantage. And this is pretty aggravating, and I
it's
want
very
to
bad.
inflict it on the rest of our audience.
Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge that there are people who are decisively on one side or the other. There are pro-union and there are pro-hospital, but there's a whole lot of people who are in the middle who aren't sure where they stand when it comes to the union. do your research, do your homework, get educated, because this is going to change everything if we get a union here.
We don't need to pay someone to do what we can do ourselves.
I'm exhausted. I am absolutely worn to the bone. I worry that the union used this as their entry, as their, you are weak, you are tired, let us help you, let us fix it. It's COVID. That's what it is. There's no solution to it but to hunker down and to just make our way through to the other side.
We will have time to make things better. Just right now, it's kind of an all hands on deck emergency. Of course, our nurses want some relief, and being promised all of these things sounds amazing, but it's not realistic, and it's not something we want sustained here at Maine Medical Center just because they happen to catch us at this time when we're weak.
So yeah, man.
And can we just make that clear to the viewers and maybe listeners who produced and was behind that ad?
Yeah, so that was Brock ultimately. Getthefactsmmc.org. And it's interesting, you guys had talked some about, and we can get more into Brock and the tactics, but Amazon created a kind of web of these anti-union websites about like, get the facts, like
do it without dues.
Facts. Yeah, exactly. Do without dues. So this is getthefactsmmc.org, which was the first website that Maine Med launched with Brock. And so it's produced by Maine Med and their union avoidance consultant. And I'll just say, the trustees of Maine Med too, and the folks that run the parent company, Maine Health. I mean, these are like CFOs of huge companies like LL Bean, general counsels for massive companies like IDX, which is another huge employer tech company here. And they're all places without coincidence that don't have unions in them also, right? And like when I talk to the AFL-CIO people, it's an interesting just kind of how they frame it of like money is one thing. And a lot of these folks come from for-profit industries. So they want to run the hospital as a profit center. And Brock's whole ideology, the union avoidance guy, is just, how do we make this into an efficient profit center? And we believe that you can maximize profits and respect your workers. Like, fair pay doesn't mean more pay. Like, it's things like that.
Yeah, I love that line so much.
This is the stuff that really drives me crazy. Yeah, the what is fair is pretty tricky to define, and also what's the other thing that really bugged me that he did?
Well, it's also
I'll come back. Go ahead.
Before I go on to that, I guess like you were talking about the one-on-one meetings and the captive audience meetings during COVID that kind of had created this interesting dynamic. So internally, the nurses, they're called education sessions, right? Like, let's re-educate you. Let's get you the facts. You don't know all these paid National Nurse Union influencers from out of state are telling you one thing. Let us give you the cold hard facts. No different than, like a Ben Shapiro or any of these just propagandists that are giving you the real stuff, the real facts, right? So when they are doing these education sessions, it's a lot of the stuff that you would see in Amazon and you could see on these websites too, right? It's making a third party of the union. The union is the outsider, company is the family. We need to protect our family from the outsider. Get your vote back, fight for your voice. You don't want to lose your voice. You're going to your seat at the table, which you have now, is going to be taken by this, always nefarious, acting in their own interest union from California. The union dues, of course, are going to make you broke, and they're meant to actually line the pockets of the big union bosses and everything, because all these people, it's so weird when I read all this stuff too, because it just seems like from another time where people are imagining these union bosses like a Tony Soprano or someone like sitting in their lawn chair, smoking a huge cigar, watching the workers go like Flynn go to work and everything, right? Like that's the picture that these people try to paint for them in their head. And it's all, get the facts, get the facts, get the facts. So when these education sessions started being leaked and people were being pulled away from literally giving vaccinations and medical care to go to education sessions, the most ridiculous thing I think that happened was Devin Carr, who I guess I'd call him a middle manager, kind of. He's like the chief nurse in the hospital, but he put out a memo basically saying, we acknowledge that these education sessions are happening. Yes, we're pulling them away from giving vital health care. And this is the type of divisiveness that a union brings to the workplace. So it was all, this is happening because you want to unionize. This is happening because of the National Nurses Union in California. This is actually all your fault. And this is actually your coworkers' fault that want a union, right? So it's
Look what you made us do.
Exactly. Look what you made me do. Now I have to re-educate you. Like now we have to do these education sessions. I didn't want to have to do this, but like we got Brock here. And again, like during these education sessions too, Brock is decked out as if he works for the hospital. He has a badge. He's in like, you know, the gear, like he looks like he works at the hospital from what I've been told. And people have caught him in elevator rides and they're like, oh, do you work for Maine Med? And he'll be like, yeah, I'm here for Maine Med. Like I've been working here for a while. So it's just, it's not good. But yeah, those are the education sessions.
So yeah, let's talk about Brock. So he, per his LinkedIn 2 years ago, called himself the unabashed liberal union buster. And he does this by things like, like making the workers feel heard, which is not to, say, be protected by a union. He's a former union guy himself. So yeah, give us the story of this guy who is very irritating. He also worked for the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas as they were fighting a unionization effort. So
yeah, I can give a quick rundown on Brock here. So Brock used to be, well, first off, I guess even further back, his whole shtick when you go to his website and everything is that I grew up in a union family. Actually, if you guys were going to church on Sundays, I was in the union hall with my dad, who was a Teamsters president. My birth was announced in the union newspaper in Philadelphia. The union is literally my identity, heart, blood, soul, right? So coincidentally, I mean, I think it was in like 2008, right? He's been in the union his entire life. He himself goes on to be the president of the Teamsters Union, right? So he is in the union. He's grown up in the union. He loses the race for, I think it was like the Treasury Secretary. It was the top head honcho decision maker for the Teamsters, right? He loses that race. Suddenly has an epiphany. He's like, oh my God, unions actually are super greedy. They want to line their pockets. They're actually worse than the corporations that we're fighting. And just like Trump kind of sued and did all these lawsuits and everything to try to push against the election results, Brock, and there's still ongoing litigation now because I tried to talk to some of the Teamsters from Philadelphia for the story. Like he sues basically saying voter fraud, this can't be right, because it was a very slim margin. So it's like, we got to re-examine everything we know about, the union vote and, our elections. So yeah, that was his like epiphany. He goes on to start a union busting firm. One of his first really big clients, like you mentioned, was Donald Trump. And of course, he's saying, it's the people that really want to work with their workers and come to a fair deal. That's who I want to work with. Donald Trump.
Only the most liberal union busted. Only the most fantastic progressive.
Exactly. Only the most progressive. So that was, I guess, Donald Trump fit the bill. He was a guy that really wants to do best for his workers, and Joe Brock just wanted to help him do that, right? And the best way to do that was actually working directly with Donald Trump. So, I mean, the irony and just hypocrisy, it's totally absurd, writes itself, basically. He was successful in breaking up that union in 2014 with Trump. And since then, I think Trump actually did come to an agreement with like the workers in that Las Vegas casino, but that was his first big thing. He
was also successful at drawing $187 an hour from Trump International. So well done to him there.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing, is that it's all painted. He's doing this the kindness of his heart. He knows more than you do because he was in it. But it's just, it's a business. He's trying to make as much money as possible. The business itself, I guess the industry, when I was talking to some of the AFL-CIO folks, is in the hundreds of millions. So Brock and the lawyers that accompany him make big bucks, obviously. And it's no different here at Maine Med, which again is just another hypocrisy that's drawn here, is that they're willing to pay this guy tens of thousands of dollars and maybe millions of dollars, right? but you can't do a small, living wage increase for your workers, right? And again, it's not, a lot of this isn't just about the money, it's just about the power dynamics too, of you don't want the workers to have a seat at the table. You don't want them to have self-determination in their working lives. And, Brock's job is to make sure that doesn't happen. He definitely, I had an interesting email exchange with him during this piece, like a back and forth. And he believes that he is a liberal through and through, and maybe he is, it's like, maybe he's just a corporatist, and I don't know, right. But he definitely holds on to that title. And because Portland is a very progressive city, we're a small city, but it's very progressive. We have very strong DSA presence here. We've done things like people referenda to get, basically a Green New Deal for the city, banning facial recognition technology. Like, these are all things that happens, in Portland, right? And so it's like a progressive place. To bring in a liberal, quote unquote, liberal union buster was maybe part of the plan to kind of appeal to people. But
Yeah.
that's Brock. I guess, like, I could talk a little bit about his philosophy that was in that kind of LinkedIn piece if you want. That's like his history.
So get into that. I just want to bring out this one part about the pay them fairly thing, and it kind of gets into, like, he uses this baseball example, which drives me insane. So he says, fair is much different standard, and one you would do well to attain. Remember, the baseball pitcher is happy to earn $20 million a season to throw a baseball. Well, he's only happy until you pay the next best guy $25 million. Your generosity just bought you a union. Like, which I would say, all those guys should be paid, a significant more. I don't know why owners versus players unions. I mean, that it's a very condescending view of pitchers, I would say. But yeah, tell me about his philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, that line, like, in some ways sums up his philosophy in a lot of ways, but he has three kind of big tenets. And again, all of this derives from his history and context of, I'm the union guy, I've been in it, I know what really goes on, I know they're greedy, I know they're bad, but I still fought like hell to maintain my position as union president. But I hate unions, like, believe me. So his kind of blueprint is like, let's keep it, we can keep this all, it's all inexpensive, it's common sense stuff. And there's like three kind of easy steps that you can follow if you want to do Joe Brock's guide to union busting. The first is the fair doesn't mean more kind of wages. So if folks talk to you about wages, actually what they really want is just to kind of be heard, and like a pat on the back and respect is actually, that's pretty fair. So that's
employee of the month.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, you just, that's all they really want. So they just want to be seen. So that's like, just be fair. Right. And again, the emphasis specifically on, it's not more. Give them, I think explicitly he says something along the lines of, treat your employees with respect, pat them on the back for the extra effort. So that's like the second part, is give them respect, right? Like, what these guys really want to do. And pretty disgusting, I thought, just how he lays it out. Honestly, it sounds like a dog or something. He's like, yeah, pat them on the head. Come on. Like, just give them a fair meal and pat them on the head. And it's like, they're good. So that's the second kind of tenet. And then the third, again, is like, let them be heard, let them be seen. I hear you, I see you, you want these things. Doesn't mean you have to act on any of those. Just basically listen to them, especially if they have ideas for cost efficiencies or job efficiency. If they can make themselves redundant, definitely listen. And if you can, pay them a fair wage, that's fantastic. And you have a better chance of doing that if you pat them on the back, as you say, I'm not going to pay you any more. So that's kind of like, that's his idea. And again, it's interesting because, like, through that, you could say, well, he looks at it as kind of, how do we make an efficient profit center? Like, the folks that are the trustees of this place, listen to your workers when they can cut costs, don't pay them anymore. Let's make as much money as possible, work them into the ground. And that's how you bust a union. Follow these easy steps and you'll avoid a union in your workplace. Thanks to Joe Brock. totally.
You see that all over the place with essential workers during this pandemic, and we need to recognize them.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
no,
That's
we
what I was
fucking
about to say.
recognize.
There's a part of it that like maybe he really is, liberal, like he's saying, because he's saying like all workers want to do is they want to be heard and be recognized and be seen. And, we understand your feelings. Instead of what people actually say is like, we want to be paid more. And we don't just want to be listened to. We want to be able to exert our power and protect our interests in a formal position in the organization that is our family, right? And that organization is this union. It's a really amazing kind of way of framing it. And again, though, that's the job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the job. And I mean, it's I'll have to say, like, I know that there's been a lot of support. There's a lot more positive support for the union inside the hospital than there is folks that don't want the union, right? And this could have even passed in the previous years if there wasn't such aggressive anti-union like combativeness and bringing in these sorts of firms. These past two pushes for a union could have succeeded. I mean, in the case of 76, when that happens, they drew out with different litigation. It was 9-10 months before it was even getting to the point of a vote on this thing. So just like already now, we've seen that the timeline is expedited. COVID has really helped with that. The ballots nicely, and I guess I can hold up, like our print paper, this was kind of timed because the ballots went out on March 28th and they are counting the ballots on April 29th. So we wanted to get this out like on the streets as this was happening and everything. But like what I'm saying is like, there's definitely going to be a vote and there's a lot of support, right? And when they did turn in their cards, there was a lot of signatures too, like, an overwhelming amount. So it seems good, but despite all of that, they must not be listening because like they're still going and doing the same things. The management is still paying Brock a boatload of money to disrupt the union. So even if you went by Brock's tenets and you listened to the workers, right, and you actually acted and not just like you said, like, yeah, like they just want to be seen, heard, recognized. If they actually were recognizing the wants of their workers, then there would be a union because that is the overwhelming want and need. So yeah, it's this could have happened earlier. I think like there should already be a union at Maine Med, and there's this, I guess, like we talked a little bit about just kind of what this would mean too, if this were to pass, just in terms of numbers and the scale of it. But now in the Maine States Nurses Association, which is our state of, nurses, workers, there are 2,000, like you said, and there are about 1,900 nurses that would join that from Maine Med. It would almost double the size of the nurses union here, which is just huge. And it would it would cause a ripple effect, hopefully, for the rest of Maine, right? Where there can be more, pushes for unions. And again, it's part of, a lot of this is, to do with like, there's the PRO Act and there's a lot of things happening on a national level that makes people feel really empowered. The stuff is happening at Amazon, which just have terrible, terrible, working conditions with the peeing in bottles, defecating in bags. People are realizing that things are bad for the people that just got us through this pandemic, like really bad. So I think, I'm hopeful about everything, but we'll see how it all plays out. End of the month is when the vote happens, but it would totally change, the Nurses Association here and probably the push for organized labor in Maine too, hopefully.
Godspeed, Maine nurses. Nathan, tell us about Mainer.
Oh yeah, so Mainer. So the Mainer News Co-op, who I published this piece with, based in Portland, is a cooperative too. A little bit of history of it is that it used to be the Alt Weekly here in Portland, like 15 years ago it was, and it's a small enough city that because we do go off of local ads and everything, like producing a weekly paper and having the revenue to do that becomes a tricky financial, balancing act. So just like a lot of other local papers, this was, I think, 15 years ago, a private equity firm came in. I can't remember the name of it. It was, the paper at that point was called the Casco Bay Weekly, the Alt Weekly, and it was owned by one guy. He had not been making money on it for a couple of years because do you guys know like Boston Phoenix and like the Phoenix, that Alt Weekly kind of network? So they started in Boston, and then they kind of started McDonald's modeling, like alt weeklies and other similarly kind of liberal progressive places. Portland being one of them. So they started as the Boston Phoenix, opened up a branch here. They went after a lot of the advertising market that we were obviously with too at that time. So it became not a good investment, right, for the individual that was owning the Casco Bay Weekly. He gets approached by a private equity firm. He sells out. He makes a bunch of cash, puts in a skeleton crew, the PE firm does. The editors of that paper, the Casco Bay Weekly, wanted to keep kind of like the spirit of it alive. And so they started Mainer. It has been around and survived since then, which I think is a pretty unique thing in this day and age, just to have a small kind of indie paper that will let someone like me who, built a little Twitter following, trolling like Ben Shapiro and people, and would think that's funny. And it's like a good fit for me is what I'm saying. And it's like a weird thing too.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a great organization. And yeah, we're split into two tiers, worker owners and worker contributors for the co-op. I'm a worker owner, and to do that, you have to produce at least 12 stories a year. So about once a month. So all the columnists and everything. Then all the freelancers, which we have like about 30 freelancers that contribute with us. They're in the worker contributor tier, but it's a great paper. I feel super lucky to have met them and everything. They found me on Twitter after I did this story on crazy gun shop owner in rural Maine that uses his billboard to push like InfoWars propaganda, basically, about libtards and Democrats and Hillary the Hildebeest and all sorts of things. He's like locally famous. But yeah, again, they would publish something like that. And
Yeah.
I just feel very lucky to meet them. And I hope that more alt weeklies and stuff can survive across the country because, like this story on Brock, there were in the big Maine papers, there was literally 2 mentions of his name, one in the Portland Phoenix, which was that paper that again, like came up from Boston. They're pretty much defunct at this point too, because Boston Phoenix went out of business. Again, just kind of a skeleton crew putting out some articles that not many people see or anything. And then there is a progressive paper here that's a nonprofit run by the Maine People's Alliance. They're called The Beacon. And so they mentioned him once, but all the big papers didn't talk anything about Brock. No one, just regardless of all these wanted posters hung up literally across the city, not a big place, everyone's seeing them. There's no mention of him. And part of that is that, there's pretty clear pipeline from these big papers, the mainstream papers, to go work in PR and maybe in some cases, these sorts of firms. So they avoid tangling, especially with someone like Maine Med that does employ a lot of writers that used to be at the Portland Press Herald, for instance. It's stuff like this that, we're one of the few people that actually cover this and give airtime to what's going on from the lens of like this union avoidance campaign. And our idea with the piece was that, again, it would be out on the streets for this entire month. We print about 20,000 of these every month. And we move them pretty well. So they're around, like people could see it. They would know the wanted poster because that became a local meme, basically. And we tried to make it understandable enough that you could look at this, this story and understand that this is who's behind this push. This is like what's happening here. You can understand what a union does and doesn't do. And anyone that picks up a paper around Portland's and where, in all across the coast and in some parts of central Maine, that like anyone could understand it. So that was kind of the goal. I think, we've done decently well with that, but that's Mainer also.
Yeah. Awesome. That story reminds me of the way the spirit sort of maintained. It's sort of what Defector is going through with Gawker and Deadspin. So yeah, that's at Mainer News Co-op on Twitter. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us on Left Reckoning.
Oh, thanks for having me. I was very happy to meet you guys and everything, just because, I've known you guys and, TMBS made a huge impact on my life. Majority Report has made a huge impact on my life. Just the work that you guys have done has definitely, along with some other folks that I've met online and elsewhere, have like pushed me to try to do something like this as a career, which I never thought was in the cards for me. Right. And it's just, you guys just made a huge impact on my life in a very positive way. And happy to chat with y'all.
Well, thank you, Nathan. Yeah, your Twitter feed makes a great impression on my life every single day. So
I've been trying to like keep a distance from Twitter a little bit just because it's.
I know where you're coming from with that. But there was the glory days of just really going after Ben Shapiro, and that stuff was really fun.
Oh yeah, those are great days and still fun to do. It's just, and again, like I'm happy it's fun to do that. I met folks like Vic and everybody who are now like great friends in life and stuff, but it's just, looking at that stuff every single day just wears on you. And it's just a nebulous thing where you don't see the impact of your work necessarily in a lot of ways. And just for myself, I was like, this is the first time you're meeting me, but a lot of people have just a set idea of who I am as a person, or that I'm going to be like a troll under a bridge when they would meet me. But I'm a very person that is like pretty engaged in things like around me and cares about stuff. And I don't know, I like this. I would like to take any frustrations like that out on David Brock. I mean, not David Brock, Joseph Brock, rather than like Ben Shapiro, because I can see like a very tangible impact. And that's part of the stuff that I really like about, working here with Maine or locally. You can see the impact of your work and it feels good.
There's a bit more substance. Those guys like Shapiro, they're fun, but it is sort of like the giant inflatable tube man.
Yeah, you can just punch
just
it
doing
over
racism.
And over and it keeps coming back.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's the Ben Shapiros of the world too, man. I mean, he's making, and it's unfortunate because you guys were super early on all that, and it's always fun. And I'm attracted to the dunces of the world too, that will just shoot themselves in the foot. Like this guy, Joseph Brock, like those websites that Amazon made for anti-union stuff, super slick, really good. His sites, like graphic design is my passion level bad, very bad, like really poorly made, just objectively. Ruben, not funny, objectively, very stupid, like not stupid, inept, like not good at what he does. So I like those people in general. There's a lot of people out there like that, like Joseph Brock too. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to apply the skills of going after and, being mean to bad people.
Well, on that note, Nathan, thank you very much.
For sure. Good chatting.
back, everybody. That was a fun conversation with Nathan, wasn't it, man?
Yeah, I loved it. I'm a big fan of Nathan.
Yeah. No, he's got a good attitude, and that story's insane.
Yeah.
From the liberal union buster to them literally, like, that's one of those things you're amazed that they spend so much money on these firms, and then nobody tells them that, hey, it's probably a bad idea to vaccinate all of these people, to have them jump the line in front of everybody.
Well, I love a guy who was a union president for 2 decades or something like that, and doesn't start talking about the corruption in unions until he loses an election that he was really upset about, and becomes a consultant about how to bust unions. Like, oh, thanks for all your help. The unabashed. I love putting that out as a place as a bit of LinkedIn culture. The unabashed liberal union buster is, and then all this hogwash about how he only wants to work with clients who are willing to meet their employees' expectations or whatever the fuck about how they need to be recognized. And meanwhile, he's working with Donald Trump.
I hate that so much.
It's amazing.
Like the whole kind of rhetoric about oh, just listen to your employees, make them feel a part of the crew. Oh man,
it's like if we could only invent fancier and fancier stickers, then we'd have labor under control.
It's not the same kind of thing, but I think one of my earlier moments of realizing, well, obviously you hate the bosses, but just realizing that capitalism is a really fucked system. So I worked at this seafood buffet in South Carolina, which is the largest seafood buffet in the Southeast. It sat around 3,000 people. But when you would come in, they had all these signs that were really insane. And they would say things like, leave your life at home. Like when you come into work, you need to drop everything about yourself as a person and only think about maintaining a positive experience for the guests.
Oh, right.
And for me, it's God, this is such a dehumanizing system. That I'm sure Brock's very kind of squishy, liberal mindset would have helped them prevent somebody like me from becoming radicalized. Because realizing just how cruel the system was, is saying oh yeah, don't think about your family or anything that's difficult that's happening in your life when you're serving people crab legs.
Yeah, they'll come in and just say David, you can change your official title to goalie, and you'll feel really seen by team goalie.
No, exactly. No, but anyways, that stuff is so nasty. Well, I wanted to talk about this report that just came out from Grist, a partnership between Grist and the Texas Observer, because it hits on a lot of questions that we're going to start to have to deal with as we transition away from fossil fuels, but also try to reckon with the devastation that it's caused and the amount of people in this country who do work in that industry and are very much up for grabs, because our opponents are going to try to be doing everything that they can to make the average kind of fossil fuel worker think of themselves as more tied to the bosses than to the rest of us. And as the left, if we want to make this transition, not if we want to make this transition just, we 100% need to be including these workers in our visions of the future. But also, if I'm just going to be completely honest, if we want to be successful, we're going to need to do this, because we cannot deal with a backlash. And we actually have in this moment a very big opening, especially when it comes to oil in Texas and in New Mexico, because the price of oil has dropped so dramatically that a lot of people are recognizing that their jobs and their livelihood and their work is on the chopping block, while the people at the top of their organizations are sitting pretty. So this piece, I highly suggest people check it out. It's in Grist and Texas Observer. The title of it's called Waves of Abandonment. It was written by Clayton Aldern, Christopher Collins, and Navina Sadasifiam. And it sort of goes through what's been happening in West Texas and New Mexico over the past year. As folks probably are familiar with, there was a massive drop in the price of oil, which meant a lot of rigs and wells stopped being profitable. And 7,000 wells they are estimating went under over the past year. Grist and the Texas Observer estimate that they think an additional 13,000 will as well. So already double what we're dealing with here. And this creates a lot of problems, but let's just start with the most obvious environmental one. Well, if you create a structure that is designed to pump oil from below the ground to the surface, and then you stop pumping that oil, what do you do with that well? Well, you're supposed to plug it up. But these companies either aren't plugging them up or doing a really shoddy job of that. And it is polluting people's water, their land. And for folks who aren't from Texas or aren't familiar with this, there's another tension because we have a separation between land rights and mineral rights. And what that means is like you could have a ranch or a farm, and you own the land, but what's underneath the land might be owned by a private oil company, which means they can come onto your property and drill for oil. And they're supposed to legally have, they have a responsibility to plug those up when they're not using them or, take care of it. But as you know, and I'm sure most people can imagine,
Super diligent about that.
They are not very diligent about that. But it's getting even worse when you're seeing this massive glut in the price of oil, because a lot of those wells have had the ownership pass through like 4 or 5 different hands. And it's almost like what happened during the financial crisis, during the housing crisis, where like nobody knew who actually owned the buildings anymore. And that's also happening across the state of Texas, where, you have so many different speculative like organizations that are supposedly running the well. And then it's hard to even figure out who owns it in the first place. Well, because of deregulation and obviously short-sightedness from the Texas GOP and anti-human organization, a lot of these groups have not put in enough money to deal with the cleanup and the maintenance that is necessary to deal with what happens when you start shutting down these wells. The Texas Observer and Grist estimated, reported that people are saying that the cleanup cost of all of these abandoned wells might reach a level of $117 billion. That would be the responsibility of the state of Texas, the people in the state, the taxpayers in the state to pay. Not the corporations or the oil companies who over the past 100 years have profited richly from destroying the land around this state. Not them, but the people, most of us whom did not receive nice paychecks from this kind of ravaging of the land and of our natural beauty, and also arable land and ranch land. And it's bad when you talk to ranchers, as this piece does, about what they're dealing with, because they have huge parts of their land which they can't use. They're worried about contamination to their water, which is a huge problem, especially like water is already a problem in West Texas, as you can imagine, because it's hot as hell, it's arid. Imagine that compounded with the fact that now oil is probably leaking into your underground aquifers because some asshole finance company based in New York City just decided that they're just going to walk away from their investment. And the GOP in this state is not going to follow through and force those companies to pay what they should be paying.
Yeah, this reminds me of back when libertarians were more of a thing. You don't really see that so much, but that phrase of people use who, when they're commonly, voicing corporate propaganda, is, why don't you go read Economics 100? And I always said because that was because they don't teach externalities until Economics 102.
That's pretty
because libertarians it's such a very clear basic concept, but it's one that's just antithetical to capitalism. Just never deal with maintenance or externality at all. It's always our problem.
And that's really the tension here. So it's like in Texas, this is quoting from the piece. In Texas, producers with 100 wells must post a bond of $250,000. That may sound like a large sum, but it works out to only around $3,968 per well for a producer with 63 inactive wells. which is the average number of inactive wells operated by almost 1,500 oil companies with the state's most idled wells. To put that into perspective, the average cost to plug a single orphaned well is $30,000. When wells are inactive for extended periods of time, the states may require companies to post additional bonds, but companies can get around that requirement by simply reporting them as producing a small amount of oil or gas. Without adequate inspection capacity, the states can't verify these claims. And this is why it's important. Like, this is a story that's important just like on a basic level of somebody who reads the news, like, oh, this is an outrage that they're doing this. This is why it's really important as we transition into whatever this next form of energy production is going to be, is that oil is not as profitable as it used to be. The Texas Observer and Grist believe and are estimating that the price of oil per barrel is going to drop below $50 a barrel and $49 a barrel in 2022, which is a strong indicator that a lot of these wells will go defunct, which means across the state and across New Mexico and other places that produce oil, these wells are just going to be sitting hazardous environmental catastrophes, just waiting to happen, not waiting to happen, continuously happening, essentially. This is why we need a Green New Deal, but we also have to tap into this reality that there's still money to be made in oil production. There's still money to be made in dirty fuel. But for the average worker, they can see that things are shifting. And if we do not, as the left, take advantage of this power that workers have to fight for a shift that is just and protects our environment, what will end up happening is an abandonment of these oil wells and a sitting environmental catastrophe that will be paid for by taxpayers and everyday working people in this country, instead of the folks who profited and made a shitload of money off of the ravaging of the land for 100 years. Do you understand the difference that I'm trying to make, the point that I'm trying to make here? It is clear that there is a shift, just like on an economic level, away from these fuels, right? And these sources of energy. But if we do not take advantage of the moment that we have right now and try to include oil workers into a shift to a green economy, what's going to happen is we're going to shift to the green economy, and then we're all going to have to pay for the oil companies' greed. We have to do something different. We have to stand up for the environment. We have to stand up for indigenous folks in these communities who are extremely disadvantaged, when it comes to dealing with the environmental crisis and the cost of cleanup here. And we have to stand up for working people who should not have to foot the bill for an industry that has destroyed communities and destroyed the land.
You mentioned about what, $3,500 per well.
Yeah,
which like at the height of like oil or like a reasonably high oil prices, that's like 20 to 30 barrels. Just put aside that for just the future mess that this is going to cause. That's the one thing that I think it's hard to wrap your mind about these bottom line decisions. This is just the cost of doing business, and baked into the cake that like, yeah, we're going to be able to escape some of these costs. And it's disgusting. And people should have, you should be able to talk to the average Texan or whoever, whatever part of the country that, I'm North Dakota, right? Like, you have a sense of pride in your environment and the place you live. This shouldn't be nobody wants to be in the position to defend this. And
No, it's just like, one of the things that I always found, like, we talked on TMBS. We haven't had him on Left Reckoning yet, and I'm sure we will. I'd hope to in the future. But, Ryan Pollock, who is a great union organizer here in Central Texas, who got the AFL-CIO to pass a Green New Deal resolution. And as I always say, that to get the AFL-CIO to do that in Texas means that you're working with people who work either directly or indirectly with fossil and dirty fuels, right? But they were able to do that because people in those industries understand that there is a shift that is happening and that these industries are not going to be as profitable as they've been throughout their lives. And they also understand that the people who are going to be able to walk away from this scot-free are the people who made millions, while the people who were the actual workers who are producing this stuff are going to be left out to dry. And we have to take advantage of the moment while we have it, because it's going to shift. It's we're seeing the shift already happening before our eyes.
I mean, I saw it happen with my younger brother. He finished with an engineering degree and had offers from oil companies in Houston, and chose to go to a manufacturing company instead because of how volatile oil was. And it wasn't because he was listening to his leftist brother like rail on about how evil oil is, right? It was because everyone knows, and those fucking oil companies have to do song and dance about how they're like greening up, right? Because that's a huge labor force issue for them.
You should read the Financial Times when they write about oil, right? Like they love these young new executives of oil companies who they understand climate change is real, blah blah, because the oil companies understand that they have to do, they can't do the denial anymore.
Damn.
Well, let's go into these other international stories, because I think they're really important. And in the post game, I want to say that Matt and I are going to spend a little bit of time with a great interview that was in Jacobin this week with former Bolivian vice president, who is one of the great socialist theorists of our time, and it's going to be definitely something that's worthwhile engaging with. This interview, if you haven't had the chance already, and sort of talk about the Bolivian project and what that means for the U.S. left and the kind of lessons that we can learn from that. But before we wrap up and go to the post game, I wanted to talk a little bit about these elections that are coming up this weekend, because they're really important. The first is in Ecuador, which we have talked a lot about on this show. Andreas Arauz, who is a young economist, really brilliant speaker and strategist. He also has some really great interviews that are in Jacobin. Is going up against an archetype of a villain, a super rich banker named Lasso. Just even better in English, right?
It's I recently, me and my girlfriend are splitting Rosetta Stone, so I'm gonna get back into my Latin American Spanish. But Lasso as a name, just it's too perfect. It's like this is. I hate to make simulation jokes because Elon Musk has started making those and it's a little bit passe. But again, it is very nominative determinism. I think is the phrase.
I mean, I think it's okay on this level to paint the picture of villains. I don't know if you have this tweet up right now. Do you?
Yep.
This is somebody who made a very handsome profit while a lot of other people were struggling. He is a member, and this is something I try to remind folks. And we focus a lot on international politics on this show, not just because it's interesting, but because it's important, because you need to understand that if you are a worker in the United States, you are engaged in the same struggle as workers in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Brazil. There is a class of elites that are dependent on a system of hyper extraction of your labor and your work and your comrades' work and working people all across the globe to make an insane amount of money while we try to find a way to put food on the table each week. It changes, the intensity from place to place, but it's the same struggle. And this is somebody just like billionaires and trillionaires in the we don't have trillionaires yet, but we're getting very close to it. In the United States, who did very well during the pandemic when a lot of the rest of us did not.
Very well in terms of earned enough capital to buy just armies of personnel to do whatever they wanted. Right.
And again, so just because I think we'll probably clip this and put it on YouTube, Andrés Arauz is a continuation of the Correa Project, which was one of the most incredible projects of left socialist politics in Latin America that brought millions of people out of poverty, that was incredibly farsighted in its ability to try to engage the poor and working people And that was a movement that was co-opted by Lenin Moreno, who was supposed to be a successor of that movement. That's why he came into power, and almost immediately turned his back on that project and has sold the country out to the IMF, is to this day working to privatize as much of the country as possible before a new popular government comes into power. And Lenin Moreno, along with U.S. interests and a lot of other seedy actors, is trying to do everything that's possible to make this election more and more difficult for the people's will to be heard. Moreno has recently instituted a massive lockdown in the country because he has failed to protect people from coronavirus, but is now using it as a political tool to try to prevent people from showing up from the ballot box. And Arroz, who was interviewed by Pagina 12, said that Moreno's decision to close down the country generates a clear conflict. The state of exception prohibits the realization of mass events and implies the deployment of the national police and the armed forces in the streets to guarantee citizens' calmness. How is it possible for us to hold elections without the measures affecting the electoral process? And on that question, Arroz is 100% right. We all remember Yaku Perez, who was, sort of one of these people who was created in a lab to appeal to American Warrenites and other folks, to undermine the left wing, the actual material, structural left wing candidate, and to replace that with slogans. He was not successful at uprooting Arroz. So now it is a competition between a right wing banker and a left-wing economist who's trying to fight to do something different. And do you have this this tweet real quick, because it's mine. Sorry, I'll not to indulge myself too much, but it's not worth looking at read it if you're interested. But The Guardian, in their great tradition now of standing up against progress in Latin America, put out a piece that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It doesn't really get any better than that. That try to conflate Andreas Arauz with Lasso. And it's an exceptionally disgusting thing to do because, basically they interviewed a couple of professors in the country to say, oh, well, neither of these, candidates are doing enough on their platforms to talk about LGBTQ rights, right? Let's just drop that for a second to talk to just say to people, it is absurd. It is absurd to compare Lasso with Arroz on this question. Lasso is somebody who thinks that women who are raped and try to have an abortion should be thrown in prison. Arroz, on the other hand, is running on a platform that says that he wants all mothers in the country to be paid $1,000 to help out their family and their community during this campaign. I'm sorry, to compare either of these two people on their feminist credentials is just absurd and is pandering to the worst U.S. audience, which is so quick to condemn any kind of actual structural movement in the United States because it doesn't appeal to their kind of sensibilities on these kind of questions. I don't know. It's absolutely absurd. The top line is this, though. Every poll that we've seen shows that Arroz should be able to win the election by a large margin. And hopefully Sunday should be a day of celebration. But we're seeing their kind of last-ditch attempts to try to make sure that people can't show the vote, which they've been trying to do from the get-go.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit taken aback by the LGBT washing, or using that channel, strategy. Right? As
yeah,
it's an optimistic view of it shows that these are the channels that the frequency people tap in on, and they are people want liberation. And so they'll look at liberation upon certain lines, right? And so you have these, you need to jam those with, if you have an environmentalist that can take the pro OAS lines, right? You need to have someone there. Or like the elite, like the imperial structure needs to have somebody there squatting on these actual like issues.
Yeah.
In a way, you hope that people are starting to realize that a little bit more. And I think,
and the point there is not that those struggles in these countries is not important.
Right.
The point is that why is an English language publication trying to pump up this message to you in the United States with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation?
Right.
Like, that's the question. It's not even a question about what the politics are in Ecuador. It's why are they trying to create a scenario where you are thinking that a serious right-wing, like far right-winger, and a progressive socialist are somehow comparable on these questions?
And it's to create attitudes so if something happens, you don't care.
Exactly. And that's what that article is about, and that's what we saw in Bolivia too. Let's move on, and just briefly, because I want to shout this out. It's the first round of the presidential election in Peru as well, and this could be another really exciting opportunity to test the left's strength in this part of the world. It's a very crowded field, but Veronica Mendoza, who is basically the leftist candidate in this election, has been running her campaign in a very exciting and people focused and workers focused way, and particularly has been talking about water inequality, which is something that we talk a lot about on the show because it's frankly extremely important. Privatization of water is something that was imported into Latin America through United States backed economists and the United States military, essentially, for years and years. And while Peru does not have privatized water, it's something that is very much on the agenda. And I highly suggest too that people follow and support Kawashuan's news, which we've been relying on a lot for our coverage of Bolivia, and they have now launched a full website along with a video platform, and I believe they have a Patreon too that you can support. Very much an incredible and very useful source of information in English on the fights and social movements in Latin America. But I want to quote real quick from their piece on the Peruvian left confronts neoliberal water inequality, where they quote Mendoza, who showed up in a rally on March 6th on the streets of Lima, saying, "You cannot privatize water. It is a human right and a public good that the state has to bring to all families. It is unacceptable that in a country that has sustained economic growth, we have thousands of families who do not have water, who do not have basic services. That is exactly what we want to change." And hopefully on Sunday, there's a positive result for that, because as they note in this piece too, between 7 and 8 million Peruvians don't have access to regular access to drinking water, which is not just a problem, unfortunately, in Peru. It's a global problem, and it's a problem that we face in the United States as well.
Yeah,
I want to
cover it last week here.
I'm curious what you think about this, but I want to compare this to what our vice president of the United States is saying about water, because it's quite striking.
Yeah, here she is.
And here's the other thing, because I also, I'm in a lot of meetings on foreign policy. For years and generations, wars have been fought over oil. In a short matter of time, they will be fought over water. So when we think about building up our economy around our infrastructure on something like water policy, it's literally about jobs. It's about the fundamental source of life that Tammy Duckworth was talking about. It will sustain life. And it's about strengthening up our nation.
I like that jobs came before life.
Yeah.
Around a commodity that is a precious commodity.
Yeah, let's just get that last part once.
It will sustain life. And it's about strengthening up our nation around a commodity that is a precious commodity.
Is that the end of it too?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any first thoughts on that? I have a lot, but I feel like I've been going for a little while.
No, I'll let you cook. I mean, my only thoughts are sort of aesthetic, which is that she's bad at when she talks about issues with gravity of modulating her tone. I feel maybe not, but maybe this is how you're supposed to talk about the future water wars. But I don't know.
Well,
Seems a
no,
bit-
I mean this is something that people should be very worried about when they see somebody saying this. Not just because of she's calling water a commodity, which is absolutely disgusting. And like as socialists, obviously we think about that transition from something that is just necessary to sustain human life into something that is commodified, that is marketized, that should be ringing alarm bells. But I think even people who aren't socialists can recognize that that is a very frightening way to talk about water, which we just cannot survive without.
yeah.
Because when you talk about something like a commodity, you exclude and prohibit the conversation that this is a right. Because if it's a commodity, it's something that can be bought or sold, right? It's not something that is, naturally created and should be preserved to be that, right? It is something. It's something that's on the market.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, it's like this is a turning point, honestly, like in the history of capitalism, where water starts to become privatized. I would think, right? Like,
And we're seeing that especially in Kamala Harris's home state of California, where when she was in positions of power in that state, saw more and more privatization of water in California. Very worrying. It's extremely important to juxtapose that with what people are talking about in Peru, what Veronica Mendoza is saying in Peru, right? Where the left in that country is talking about making sure that we never, ever, ever allow this to be something that can be fought over. And then to juxtapose that with the vice president of the United States, the seat of empire, saying like this. I hope I make this point clear to folks, right? Like, I love, like, I'm the child of hippie folks, right? Like, I love my hippie friends, but I've been hearing about how we fought wars over oil. The next thing we'll be fighting over is water. My whole life from folks, right?
yeah,
And like obviously, I see that as a very scary concept. But I'm going to tell you one thing: it's a lot scarier to hear that from somebody who's the vice president of the United States, somebody who's privy to some of the most important strategic conversations that this country has, versus somebody who just wants to make sure that we have more organic food or hemp or whatever the hell, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's very frightening to hear her say this. And also, let's not forget the context of this conversation is in trying to sell Joe Biden's infrastructure plan, right? Saying we're trying to make sure that we have as much control over water so that we can protect ourselves from the water wars that are coming. That's the mindset of these folks. We talk about we've talked a lot about water on the show because I think we both think it's extremely important, right? And our water systems are very much underdeveloped. But when we talk about how they're underdeveloped, we're talking about trying to make sure that they have access and free flowing to folks. What they're talking about here is exclusive control of the United States government out of something that is so essential.
Yeah, it's dark when one side wants to privatize and get as much profit from it as possible, and like the most charitable view you could have of Kamala when she says jobs is like, oh, we can at least put people to work for a bit more because of how profitable this water is going to be, which is not the reason I really like water as an element on this planet. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Nightmare stuff. And we gotta keep our eyes out.
It's like you hear it from somebody who is anti-war. It's one thing, but from somebody who is very possibly the next unelected president of the United States.
And this isn't a private conversation. Like, this is her trying to sell the infrastructure thing, and they're trying to sell it in one of the most frightening. We talked, I remember a couple years ago, I guess only a year. Jesus Christ, man. About Warren's green military plan. Remember we did that?
Yeah.
And how much of a nightmare that was. The fact that the Biden administration right now is talking about the United States controlling strategic resources like water should make any peace-loving person take a second and say like, okay, this is very serious and not something that we can sleep on.
Yeah, on top of everything else going on in foreign policy.
Yeah.
All right, folks. The post game will probably start a little bit after 10 tonight. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning to get access to that. We'll get the audio out for people a little bit earlier tonight. And we'll talk a little bit more about infrastructure. Pete Buttigieg got busted in a way that, look, I'm very anti-car and pro-bicycle for someone who doesn't ride bike and hasn't in a long time. But Pete did the side a bit dirty, and we're going to play that clip and also talk about another way the Biden administration is going short on, not going short, but going small on infrastructure. And what else do we got in the post game, David?
We're going to be going into some real serious lessons from Bolivia for the U.S. left, and
right.
also a little bit of a lesson for some, folks who consider themselves to be leftist commentators or whatever, and ask the question, well, if the United States is in such bad shape, why are you not spending more time actually trying to learn lessons from other successful parts of the world? So that in the post game, plus Discord questions. So definitely join us on patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
All right, folks. Patrons, we will see you in about a half hour. Thanks, everybody else.